Boldwood presents The Sweet Life Café, written by Helen Rolfe and read by Karen Cass. Prologue. Celebrating the life of Gayle Rafferty. Please join friends and family as we honour Gayle Rafferty during this funeral to be held on the 26th of September of this year. Dress code: informal, bright colours. Absolutely no black allowed, unless it's your shoes. Location: the Sweet Life Café, Bay Street, Anchor Island. Time: 4 p.m. Arrive hungry with plenty of room for pudding. No need to RSVP, the more the merrier. Chapter 1. Addie. Addie Rafferty was running late. Again. She picked up the pile of post from the doormat and dumped it, along with a collection of junk mail, on the table. The blue envelope on top caught her eye with its Anchor Island postmark, but she didn't have time to deal with whatever it was right now. She had to get to work. She'd already been late several times recently, and she didn't need another black mark against her name. This job was the only way she could afford this flat, which wasn't homely by any stretch of the imagination, but was at least a roof over her head, and with her 7-year-old son Isaac to think about too, she had to keep making ends meet the best she could, and perhaps accept that this was just the way it was. Having skipped breakfast, in a rush to get Isaac organised for staying at his grandparents' for the weekend so she could put in more hours for work, she reached for the last remaining tea cake from the batch she'd baked with him on Sunday, grabbed her bag, and left to walk the short distance from her flat in Harrow to the tube station. The blue envelope was still on her mind as she boarded the tube and began the relatively short commute into London. It hadn't looked like Aunt Gayle's writing on the front, but who else would be sending her a letter from Anchor Island? Addie and her sister Susanna rarely heard from Aunt Gayle, and vice versa. The last time Gayle had been in touch, it was a few months ago with a birthday card for Addie, and before that, a short letter to remind them that their father's things were still in her attic. They'd been there for 30 years, ever since he died and the girls went to live with her. Addie had taken charge of replying to say that she and Susanna would come and sort through things soon, although both she and Susanna had known it would be a big leap when they eventually did it, given neither of them had been back to the island in almost 20 years. Even Isaac's relentless questions about her years growing up on an island in the English Channel hadn't instigated a visit. As the tube continued to head into the heart of the city and the office where she worked as a senior digital designer for a web agency, Addie pushed away her concerns about Anchor Island and Aunt Gayle and thought about the day ahead instead. She had a big presentation to deliver, and although she liked to think she wasn't bad at what she did for work, the fact was, it wasn't her dream job, never had been, and on some days, that made it so much harder to give it her all. On the train, she was surrounded by a mishmash of people, some dressed in jeans, others in smarter dress, like the woman in a sharp suit with pointed stilettos. Did she do her whole commute in those? Addie had long since given up on heels, favouring trainers until she reached the office. Another man leaned against the metal safety pole, frantically scrolling on his phone. On the seat closest to him, a woman was tapping away on a laptop, seemingly desperate to get finished whatever it was she was in the middle of. Addie wondered how many of these people were working in their dream job. How many people truly got to do what they loved when there was the pressure of bills to pay and hungry mouths to feed. Sometimes you had to do what was necessary, and that's exactly what Addie had done. She'd wedged herself into a life that did what she needed it to do. It provided. She earned good money. The rented flat she'd lived in for the last 5 years was close to a half-decent school for Isaac, and while she wasn't on the property ladder, she still had some savings put by in the vague hope that she would be one day. As the tube shunted her closer and closer to her destination, she thought about the upcoming weekend. Except it wasn't a weekend. Not for her. She'd be catching up with work, albeit from home. To at least make it bearable, she planned to stay in her pyjamas all day, and the second she was finished, she'd bake a lovely pudding to enjoy after her dinner. Chocolate soufflé would be perfect, and already she was thinking about enjoying it with a glass of wine. She'd picked up a bargain bottle of Pinot Grigio on a special deal from the corner shop the other day when she'd raced in to buy bread so Isaac would at least get a sandwich in his packed lunch. She couldn't really afford it and didn't buy wine often, but sometimes she needed a little something for herself to take the edge off the grind of day-to-day life. She thought about Isaac, with his crazy blonde curls and dazzling smile, who loved chocolate soufflé just as much as she did. Her little boy was the love of her life, and it pained her that she couldn't give him more. Instead of a grotty flat with no outside space of their own, she longed to give him a garden, fresh air rather than a sea of smoke from the crowd of teenagers who hovered outside their building. She wanted to give him a bigger bedroom to build his Lego. She wanted to spend every weekend baking with him rather than working. She wanted to bask in the sound of his gentle giggles and make the most of the time they had before it was too late and he was all grown up. At least Isaac had Maury and Jarrett, his paternal grandparents. They filled some of the void Isaac's disinterested father Jonty had left when he'd taken off for South America and never came back. Maury and Jarrett's house in Ruislip was a real home too, a place where Isaac had his own bedroom and a great long garden to run around in and play outside whenever he felt like it. It should have been a quick walk from the tube to the office, but the gods of whatever it was that controlled being on time were conspiring against Addie today. First, there was a problem at the ticket barrier, with queues backed up. Then she was lost in a swarm of people trying to get up to street level. And after being jostled about, when she finally emerged, there was a street cordoned off due to a police incident, and she was forced to take a longer route to the office. To top it all off, she was about to enter the building, but collided with someone and ended up with coffee down the front of her shirt. She'd planned to go straight to the bathroom after dumping her bag to deal with the coffee spill before it really set into the material of her shirt, but she didn't get a chance. She'd only just put her bag down when her boss passed by her desk and said, "A word, please." He didn't need to add the instruction to follow him into his office. She exchanged a look with her colleague Sally, who was sitting opposite. "Probably about my meeting later. I'm a bit nervous." "You've got this," said Sally. "They'll love you." She looked at her shirt and pulled a face that suggested they wouldn't, not if her personal appearance was any indicator of her competence. Presenting to potential clients still had the power to make Addie anxious, no matter how many times she'd done it before, and today's client, if they chose this web agency, would be a big coup for the team. She needed to review the presentation she'd put together, the presentation that would show the client how she'd translated their concept into engaging online content, which would generate sales and boost their business. The Goldfish Bowl office with a glass partition had no door, so she went inside and took a seat when her boss, Raymond, looked up and gestured for her to do so. She hoped he wasn't about to throw another project her way, given she already had a ton of work to catch up on this weekend. Raymond eventually finished whatever he was typing on his keyboard and looked over the top of his thick-rimmed glasses. "Is everything all right, Adeline?" "Of course." She forced a brightness into her voice. "I know I was late again today." She looked down at the front of her shirt. "Problem at the tube station, a road closure, and someone with a full coffee cup knocked into me." "Right." He chose his words carefully, or at least that's how it seemed. "Is there anything I need to know?" "Well, let me see," she thought. "My job doesn't interest me. I'm just doing it for the money, and to be honest, I'd rather be at home with my son this weekend, or baking all day, rather than working. Oh, and you keep calling me Adeline, which nobody else does, so please stop it." Raymond had always used her full name. She'd given up trying to correct him. And she supposed in a heavily male-dominated team, Adeline did sound a bit more serious than Addie. It was just that nobody called her Adeline anymore. It was what her dad had called her, and since he'd died, she'd found it painful to hear. So she'd switched to the name her friends at school used. "I'm fine, honestly," she said, instead of sharing what she was thinking. "Everything is under control." "Are you sure?" Totally. He nodded, accepting she wasn't going to divulge anything further. You're meeting with a client today, Adeline. He steepled his fingers beneath his chin, elbows on the table. It's an important client. This could mean big business for us. I'm fully prepared, I promise. I plan to do a quick review of my presentation and then I'm set to go. First impressions really count. So he'd seen the stain. Not hard, really. It stood out a mile. I can pop out, grab another shirt from somewhere nearby, she said. Not that she had the time, nor the funds to splash around, but what choice did she have? See that you do, and Adeline, he added before she could scoot back to her desk. Perhaps keep a spare set of clothes here just in case, and maybe get an earlier train. He'd delivered his instructions as if they were easy. An earlier train was impossible given the time before school care started for Isaac. The extra clothes she could do, which should have made her feel slightly better, except it didn't. Still, given this was the 4th time she'd been late for work in the last fortnight, Raymond had gone pretty easy on her. What was all that about? Sally asked when she got back to her desk. Sally had never seen eye to eye with Raymond. She pushed all his buttons, but she seemed to enjoy the challenge and she loved her job, unlike Addie. I have to go and buy a new shirt. She indicated the coffee stain. Raymond doesn't want me meeting my client like this, and I get it. It won't exactly give a good impression. Sally pulled open a packet of dry roasted peanuts and offered them across to Addie, who sat down, defeated, at her desk. Fair enough, but don't stress. You don't have to buy anything. I don't? She took a handful of peanuts. The tea cake from earlier hadn't filled her up in the slightest. I have a spare shirt, and a bra, knickers and trousers. She leaned closer to Addie. Remember how I stayed out all night a few weeks ago? How could I forget? It still made Addie smile. The tale of Sally's love life, which was a riot compared to her non-existent one. No way did I want McTwat to know I'd been out all night, Sally went on, so I bought new clothes on my way in, and since then kept a spare outfit here. You know, just in case. Ever the professional, me? Apart from my funny names for people. Sally, a massive fan of Grey's Anatomy, was into labelling people with a "muck" prefix. So far there was McHottie for Alan, who worked in accounts, McPerv for Bob, who talked to your cleavage, McMisery for Chris, the security guard, who hadn't smiled once in the whole year he'd worked at the main doors to the office block they shared with 4 other companies. Sally disappeared out of view for a moment as she bent down to open the bottom drawer of her filing cabinet. She sat back up again and passed across a shirt after making sure nobody had their beady eye on them. You're a lifesaver. Thank you. I really can't afford to buy another one. I'll bring it back washed and ironed. Sally popped a few peanuts into her mouth and swished a hand to dismiss any concern about the shirt. Addie went off to the ladies to get changed, and, being the only one in there, she lingered in front of the mirror. What had happened to the Addie Rafferty who, despite losing her parents, had begun to find happiness on an island in the English Channel? What had happened to the girl who enjoyed baking and had once felt like it could be the start of an exciting journey for her? Loyalty. That was what had happened. Being loyal to her sister and sticking to the pact they'd made as young girls had cost her. She'd lost a closeness with their aunt that Susanna had never had, and she'd never followed her passion for baking since her aunt, like her sister, seemed convinced university and academia were the key to her future. Losing all of that was worth it for the gift of her son, of course, but she greedily wanted it all. She wanted Isaac, her happiness, a job she loved, and a place where she really felt at home. But as she made her way back to her desk, she got the impression that asking for all that was asking far too much. Chapter 2. Susanna. Susanna Rafferty spotted the post on the side table when she came downstairs. She couldn't remember the last time she'd picked up the post from the mat or answered the landline because her husband, Alex, always got there first. It had led to her worrying about what he might be hiding. He insisted everything was fine, but it wasn't. In fact, Things hadn't been right for a while. Perhaps today would put her mind at ease. They'd both taken a day off with the express purpose of spending it together. No property solicitor tasks for her, no going into his dental practice for Alex. Simply a day as a married couple. As she sifted through the post, a pale blue envelope immediately caught her eye. Postmarked Anchor Island, this letter was from the place she'd left behind a long time ago. "You ready?" Alex came up behind her, the cool box in one hand. With his dark hair and tanned skin like he surfed the ocean every day rather than worked indoors, Alex was still good-looking at 47. He hadn't changed all that much since their wedding day, aside from a few lines on his face and bits of grey in his beard when he didn't shave for a while. It wasn't fair. Women drew the short straw when it came to changes as they got older. Already she'd got a rounding in her tummy she'd never had before. It felt as though the muscles she'd once had in her arms had lost a lot of their oomph, and she had aches and pains at the end of the day that 10 or 20 years ago she'd never felt. "Almost," she told him, the pile of post still in her hand. "I'm just seeing if the quote for the driveway is amongst this lot." Their driveway needed levelling, resurfacing, and 2 potholes filling in, and she'd requested quotes for a new garage door because the existing one had damaged panels and rust. Hardly surprising, given they hadn't touched it since they'd moved in. The quote wasn't amongst the letters, so she decided to deal with the blue envelope first. But as she started to tear it open, Alex picked up his keys and made for the front door. "I'll be in the car." The atmosphere was tense enough between them, and she didn't want to add to it by making him wait, so she put the envelope down. She could take it in the car with her, but she'd rather not. Whatever Aunt Gayle had to say would have to wait. "I just need to use the bathroom," she called after Alex's retreating back. She wasn't sure if he'd even heard her. As she used the downstairs toilet, she wondered what was inside the blue envelope. It wasn't her birthday or any other special occasion that warranted correspondence. She tried not to think about the island much, but when a letter arrived, she was right back there, thoughts churning over and over in her mind. Most likely the letter inside the blue envelope would be another request from Aunt Gayle for the sisters to go to the island and sort through their dad's things. They'd do it, eventually. But the thought of going back there filled her with dread. Aunt Gayle had become their guardian when their father Harry passed away just 3 years after Susanna and Addie lost their mother Cynthia. The sisters had had to watch as their semi-detached Edwardian house, just over a mile from the lively heart of the city of Oxford, had been packed up and emptied. They'd been driven down to Portsmouth by their grandparents, where they'd met their dad's sister, their Aunt Gayle, and the 3 of them had boarded an enormous ferry to take them across the Channel to Guernsey, where they'd transferred to a smaller ferry to take them to Anchor Island. Susanna had been 14, Addie only 8, and she could still remember the eerie silence between them all as they travelled from their old life to a new one, the wind whipping against their skin and the assault of salt water which left its residue in their hair long after they'd stepped onto dry land again. As they'd docked, Susanna had whispered to Addie that this wasn't forever. And later that night, at their aunt's cottage, they'd made a pact to leave Anchor Island as soon as they were old enough. The only time Susanna forgot her plans to flee was when she met Matteo Collins. 4 years older than her, he had a maturity she was drawn to, and all of a sudden she had someone in her life just for her. They had a passion she'd never expected and had never forgotten. She'd stayed out past curfew with Matteo. She'd got drunk more than once. Oh, how they'd laughed, too, and she'd felt wild, free, like an entirely different person. But Aunt Gayle had soon put an end to the relationship, and Susanna had never been able to forgive her for what she did. She was about to head out to the car when she spotted the post-it she'd slipped into the porch mirror as a reminder to pay the window cleaner. Alex usually took care of it, but a flustered call from their window cleaner this morning while Alex was taking his time in the shower proved that he hadn't. She leaned out of the front door, held up a hand to Alex to indicate she was on her way, but he was sitting with his eyes closed in the driver's seat of his shiny Lexus. She went into his study. He'd have the details for payment in the file in his desk where they kept all the bills. She paused when she saw his doodles on the jotter pad next to his keyboard. Those drawings were one of his little habits that amused her, and true to form, there was a row of stick people of varying heights next to a doodle of a house with a chimney sticking out of its roof and smoke drifting upwards. She had no idea what the drawings meant, but she'd always found it an endearing habit. She was about to leave when she spotted the familiar logo of a posh restaurant poking out from a piece of paper beneath the jotter, and out of curiosity, she pulled it out fully. They'd been to the venue for their last wedding anniversary, celebrating with a good bottle of bubbly and beautiful food. Except this receipt wasn't old. It was from a recent meal. The booking date was last week, and judging by the total amount, either Alex had eaten a meal fit for 2 kings by himself, or he'd had company. She put the receipt back where she found it, went outside, and locked up behind her. She walked towards the car, avoiding the potholes she'd been stepping over for as long as she could remember. She knew full well her husband was hiding something now. It was hardly a trip to a Harvester or a Pizza Hut that he'd neglected to mention. The restaurant was classy, only for special occasions, and it hurt that he'd clearly shared it with someone else. She felt sick at the prospect of who that person might be. Was it someone from work? It had to be. Was it a patient? Why hadn't he told her about it? She looked across at him as he reversed out of the driveway. She should ask him outright. But when he turned briefly to face her as he pulled away, she couldn't do it. She was scared, terrified of her whole world imploding. As they drove towards the parking area where they'd accessed the river, the September sun was out in full force, and there was absolutely no sign of rain. It should have been the start of a perfect day. But how could it be now? Already she wished she could lose herself in a complex property dispute instead of having to face up to her own personal problems and the possibility that her husband was cheating on her. He'd been cagey for a while, and she'd tried to tell herself she was imagining things, but now she knew she wasn't. If that dinner had been innocent, it's the sort of thing he would have told her about. He'd have detailed the courses he'd chosen, the fine wine he'd selected, balked at the cost but said it was worth it, just like they'd done together before. She needed a distraction. She opened her banking app on her phone and paid the window cleaner. When she explained what she was doing, Alex claimed to have forgotten and didn't flinch when she announced she'd been into his study to get the details. Maybe he hadn't ever expected her to be suspicious, and that's why he hadn't hidden the receipt away. Or perhaps he wasn't that clever. Maybe he'd made a mistake. Why had he agreed to spend the day with her if he had someone else? Unless he'd ended an affair to save his marriage. She felt like she wanted to run far away, make it all stop, put a pause on her life, but no chance of that. With Alex focused on the road and not making much attempt to talk, she looked out of the car window, her mind back to the day she and Alex had gone to the same restaurant and toasted their marriage, their future. Was he really having an affair? Alex pulled into the car park and found one of the few remaining spaces before they took everything they needed down to the nearest patch of green space looking out at the River Cam. Peals of laughter from a nearby group, clearly not used to punting along the river, accompanied the gentle swish of water beneath the flat-bottomed boat that glided in the opposite direction. Mild days like this would soon be put to one side until the spring. "You okay?" Alex asked, after they'd laid out the picnic rug and weighted it down with the cool box at one end and their shoes at the other. Did husbands who cheated still care whether their wife was all right? Of course. She took the can of lemonade Alex passed to her. "It's a lovely day," she added. It was a pathetically bland exchange of conversation. If she had a friend in her position, she'd be telling them to come out with it, get the truth, and move on. But it was all too easy to give advice when it didn't directly affect you, and it was much harder to act upon it when it did. Having Alex sitting so close made her realize how much she missed her husband. They shared a bed night after night, but there was a distance. She longed to be able to take his hand or lay her head on his shoulder and instinctively know that everything was okay. Alex's can of Coke gave a satisfying hiss of release as he flicked it open. "We got the best of the weather," he said in response to her comment. How had they ended up like this, with so little to say? Since when had time together become snatched and not the way it once was? Her job as a property solicitor was demanding, and Alex's work as a dentist left little opportunity to do things like this on a whim. Come weekends, they both had to catch up with work, her especially, and then there were chores, or it was meeting up with friends, and before you knew it, Monday had rolled around again. She'd tried to talk several times over the last couple of months about them both putting work before their relationship, but Alex's comeback had been to query why it was such a problem when that was how it had always been. He was right, but it had worked before, and now, somehow it didn't feel as though it did. Before, they'd always found time at the end of the day to connect. She almost wished she hadn't found the receipt, that her mind wasn't now heading in a direction she'd never wanted it to go. Alex leaned closer and gave her an unexpected peck on the cheek. "Time to relax," he said, and lay back on the rug, reaching for her hand so she would lie back with him. Did husbands who were cheating still kiss their wives or hold their hand? Was it all a ploy to put the wife off the scent? She tried to relax, but she couldn't, and after a few minutes she propped herself up on her elbows. The same group of punters who had got Susanna's attention when they first arrived had their boat moving through the water, but they kept ending up towards the middle of the river rather than gliding majestically across the surface on the right-hand side, as per the rules. "We were better than that, surely?" Alex asked. She hadn't realized he was looking too. "So much better," she said, turning to grin at him. She remembered fondly when they'd first moved to Cambridge in their 20s and made a point of punting on the cam. They hadn't done it in a while. When had they stopped having fun? Somewhere along the line, that had faded too, and she missed the way they used to laugh, the way they worked hard but had so much energy outside their jobs that she hadn't wanted anything to ever change. They were married. Neither had ever wanted kids. They were right where they both wanted to be. Or so she'd thought. Did husbands who were cheating still reminisce like this about better times, or was that a distraction technique too? "We should book a holiday soon," she said, before she could even think about how desperate the suggestion made her feel. "I'll look into when is the best time." His voice came from behind her, and when she looked, he'd closed his eyes again. The saying, "actions speak louder than words," sprang to mind. They'd been all set to secure a gorgeous villa in Tuscany earlier this year for July, until Alex pulled the plug. And since then, they hadn't discussed it again, let alone agreed on anything holiday-wise. She considered the stage of life they were at right now. She was 44, Alex was 47. They weren't part of the sandwich generation. They didn't have kids, and neither of them had a surviving parent, so there weren't those additional pressures that some of their friends had. Maybe they were just going through a rough patch. She knew others who were. One friend had found out her husband was having an affair with another man. Another friend had had a big health scare, and two of her and Alex's mutual friends were going through separate, nasty divorces. She and Alex had never really hit a rough patch before, not even when they spent a year travelling together around Australia and New Zealand on a budget in their early 20s. They'd stayed in hostels, been on the move often, and they'd watched the pennies. All of it would have tested even the closest of couples, but apart from the odd bit of bickering, they'd got on well. They'd moved in together on their return to England when Susanna was in her mid-20s and got engaged shortly after that. Both had understood the other's work ethic. They'd been well matched from the start. And since they'd married almost 18 years ago, it had felt like plain sailing ever since. Until recently. She turned to look at him again. "It's so lovely today. Should we barbecue later on?" He opened one eye. "Already got the steaks marinating." She felt tugged between the familiar Alex and the one who was so distant. "When did you do that?"
"Before you even surfaced this morning."
In this moment, things felt normal, they felt good, and they felt right. "We'll open that special bottle of wine my client gave me last Christmas," she said, in an effort to make the feeling last. But she couldn't put it off forever. She had to confront him. She needed to know the truth. She needed to know whether her marriage was over. Chapter 3. Addie. It was the middle of September, and although the underground wasn't as sweltering as it was midsummer, Addie still felt the air contract as she took the steps down into London's deep belly. At least she'd nailed today's presentation and left the office on a good note. The tube whizzed her on her way, and eventually she was back at street level and on the way to her flat. Her flat was affordable, and it had been the best out of a bad bunch when she'd landed a job and had to find somewhere quickly. The listing had certainly used a bit of artistic license, which only became apparent after she moved in. Tree-lined communal areas sounded beautiful, but once the sun came down, those areas filled with undesirable characters, and she couldn't let Isaac outside to play on his own. The flat itself had good locks on the front door and was just big enough for two, but that was where the positives ended. It came with stained carpets, windows that let in too much of the cold and damp when the seasons changed, a kitchen tap that wobbled and threatened to give up every time it was switched on, and 80s decor that was there to stay. On the plus side, her landlord hadn't hiked the rent up too much over the 5 years that she'd been there. He said she was a model tenant. She never missed a payment, she didn't make noise, she looked after the place. She did, but not everyone else was as considerate. The neighbour above was loud and for some reason dragged furniture around at all hours of the day and night, while the next-door neighbour smoked. When Addie opened her windows for fresh air, she very often had to close them right up again as smoke snaked her way. Then there was the man in one of the ground floor flats who yelled a lot, the sort of yelling that sent a shudder right through you. Isaac was scared of him, and to be honest, so was Addie, and usually gave him a wide berth. An incoming text message eased away some of the melancholy Addie felt about working over the weekend rather than spending time with Isaac. It was a message from Maury containing the single word Lego and a picture of Isaac concentrating as he added another block to the boat he was building. She replied with, "Love it," because she did, and Isaac simply made everything better. Almost 7 years ago, Addie had met a guy in a pub in central London. She'd skipped ahead of him in the queue at the bar without realising. He'd introduced himself as Jonty and said he would only be willing to accept her apology for pushing in if she agreed to go out with him. By his own description, Jonty was nomadic. He wanted to travel the world, said that wherever he laid his cap was his home, or some other phrase which meant he wasn't interested in settling down. It might have been fine with Addie had she not fallen pregnant, and suddenly their lives were intertwined forever. True to his word, Jonty hadn't stuck around for long. He'd taken off, but his parents, Isaac's Granny Maury and Grandad Jarrett, had remained a constant in her little boy's life, the son she loved with every fibre of her being. Back at her block of flats, Addie hurried past the teenagers vaping by one of the trees and upped her pace to avoid the shouty man as he came out of the front entrance with such force she was surprised the glass part of it didn't shatter. At her flat, number 6, she went through the familiar routine of pulling the door hard towards her so that the key would turn easier and let her inside. It was eerily quiet when Isaac wasn't here, but she was welcomed by the photograph of her on the wall with her arms around her son, his cheeks bright red following a day at the beach during the summer, his curls wild, his eyes full of excitement. She looked at the other framed photograph on the same wall. In the picture, her parents stood with their girls, baby Addie in their mother's arms, her older sister Susanna standing next to their dad, leaning against his leg as though she daren't let go. Susanna looked like she loved their dad as much as Addie did, and this photograph always prompted Addie to wonder why her sister seemed to forget that half the time. Addie remembered very little about her mother, but lots about her dad. He'd always championed her. When she got her grade 1 flute, he'd let out a whoop. When she had a small part in the school play, he'd been in the front row on opening night with a look that suggested he thought she was the star of the show. Her dad was lovely. She couldn't think of a single thing she hadn't liked about him, and she missed him every single day. He would have loved Isaac too. Isaac didn't have any grandparents on her side, what with her mother and father both gone, so it made Addie doubly glad that Maury and Jarrett doted on him and always leapt at the chance to have their grandson to stay. She put a glass beneath the tap in the kitchen, held her breath when the stream of water slowed, but released it when the water thankfully flowed enough to fill her glass. She gulped it down, thirsty with the heat of the day, her eyes falling to the pile of post with the blue envelope on top. How different would her life have been if she'd never left Anchor Island? If she hadn't honoured the pact she'd made as an 8-year-old with her sister that they belonged in England and not on some remote island. At the time, she'd felt as if she'd been torn away from everything, their home, the memories of her dad, and the way he'd walked down the street with her on his shoulders on summer days as he took her to the park. Her world as she knew it. Over the years, talking to Susanna, she'd pieced together the parts of her dad's life that she couldn't remember. His love for a family cafe he'd longed to keep but couldn't, how he'd retrained and moved into the travel sector instead. And these days, she wondered whether her dad had been doing what she was doing now, working in a job she didn't really want to be in just to keep bills paid and food on the table. With the envelope in her hand, she thought about the island she'd promised to leave, but which she'd slowly begun to like. She remembered spending summer days by the water, seeing what sea creatures lurked in rock pools. She had fond memories of skimming pebbles from one of the little coves. She remembered making friends, but most of all, she remembered baking with Aunt Gayle and the Sweet Life Café. When Susanna left the island to go to university on the mainland, Addie had grown closer to Aunt Gayle, and she'd begun to work weekend shifts in the Sweet Life Café, a place dedicated to puddings of all kinds. At first, she'd cleaned up, swept floors, wiped down. Then she'd served customers, discussed the menu options if a customer didn't know what to choose, and eventually she'd started to bake with her aunt, particularly after hours. They'd chat, they'd laugh, and they'd eat whatever they made. They made all sorts: fruit crumbles, thick delicious custards, chocolate brownies, profiteroles, lemon meringue pie. And even if the recipe didn't quite work, there was a joy in the process and a sense of belonging Addie had found comforting. For a while, Addie felt like she'd found her place in the world, but then Aunt Gayle seemed to push her away, and she began to encourage her to return to England to take up a place at university as if that was her only option. It had hurt when Addie realised that perhaps Gayle didn't really want her around after all, and she'd never admitted to Susanna that the island by that point had begun to feel like home. She sat down at the table and tore open the envelope, which most likely contained a request she and her sister go and retrieve their dad's things from their aunt's attic. But what was inside couldn't be from Aunt Gayle. The words on the invite went blurry as her emotions took over. No matter what had gone before, no matter that she and Susanna didn't have much of a relationship with their aunt, the news was still devastating. Aunt Gayle was gone, and it was too late to repair anything now. Chapter 4. Susanna. Back home, Susanna opened the window in the lounge at the front of the house to let the fresh air filter through while the weather was still so mild. She tried not to let her imagination run riot when Alex disappeared into his study to apparently deal with some paperwork. It was possible, of course, because not only was he a dentist, he owned his practice, the practice that over the last decade had grown exponentially. She went into the kitchen and opened another window in there. She loved this house, their home. It wasn't far from the centre of Cambridge, and it reminded her a lot of the Rafferty home in Oxford before she and her sister had been forced to leave when their dad died. Cambridge, like Oxford, was thriving. It felt like real life here, not some back of beyond place like Anchor Island, where they were miles away from the mainland. If her marriage disintegrated, would Alex want the house? Would she fight to keep it? She felt nauseous at the thought of what he was hiding, as well as the confrontation she knew they needed to have, let alone what their future held. She ran her hand along the mahogany mantelpiece. This home had been a labour of love. As she and Alex had put their own stamp on it, with colour schemes and new fixtures and fittings, they'd kept its character. She loved the large rooms, the high ceilings, the fireplace that dominated the living room with its dual-aspect windows. She opened up the rear doors onto the outside space they'd redone as a classic cottage garden with plenty of greenery at the borders, giving them privacy and a feeling of nature. There was a summer house in the far left corner, a small seating area on the patio before the lawn began, and enough colour from the easy-to-maintain shrubs and flowers to feel special. They'd always wanted something that didn't require much upkeep. Their focus had been on their jobs, and still was, but perhaps that focus needed to shift if they were to save their marriage. In the upstairs bathroom, she pinned her dark hair up into a messy bun, hair that was, for now, devoid of any grey, thanks to regular touch-ups, and climbed into the shower cubicle, closing the door gently behind her because of its tendency to wobble. They really needed someone to come and look at it. She'd mentioned to Alex about redoing the entire bathroom as well as the garage door and driveway because it was getting tired and worn, but like with so many other things, they hadn't talked about it since. After her shower, she pulled on a pair of jeans and a loose-fitting t-shirt and went downstairs to prepare a couple of salads, one with buffalo mozzarella, tomatoes and basil leaves, the other with salty halloumi, bitter rocket, and thinly curled cucumber. Alex was still in his study, and she resisted the urge to listen at the closed door to see whether he was talking to another woman. He never used to shut the door. He'd always been able to focus with comings and goings, unlike her, who needed quiet and to be away from everyone when she was doing anything work-related. Once the salads were ready, she took out a couple of wine glasses. If Alex ever emerged from his study, they could open that special bottle, although right now it would feel a lot like drowning her sorrows. She glanced at the photograph on the wall of Addie's son Isaac as he jumped through the sprinklers on the lawn. It had been taken last summer and captured his personality perfectly. Addie and Susanna were still close. She loved that, and her sister was a great mum, but Susanna wished Addie had more in her life. She had a good job and said she was happy enough, but Susanna could tell something was missing. She'd always looked out for her little sister, and yet she knew she shouldn't interfere too much. She'd once floated the idea of helping Addie to get onto the property ladder by lending her money, but it had been a categoric no from Addie, followed by a request that Susanna let her stand on her own 2 feet for once. It was the only thing that had ever come between them, apart from the difference of opinion when it came to their dad. The girls tended to avoid talking about him most of the time, otherwise it risked leading to disagreement and tension. Of course, Susanna had plenty of fond memories of their time as the Rafferty family before they lost their mum, but Susanna had also kept something from her sister for years. Something that would easily explain her feelings towards their dad, and yet she could never speak of it. She really had loved him. She'd been devastated when he'd died. She just wished she'd kept the same innocence about their parents as Addie had. Addie remembered only good things when it came to their family, which, as the protective older sister, Susanna was grateful for. She did her best to fill in the blanks about their parents where she could, especially facts about their mum that Addie would have been too young to remember, and as for the rest of what she knew, well, she shielded Addie from more unnecessary hurt wherever she could. She'd done it for so many years, she had difficulty switching it off when Addie reached adulthood. More than once she'd wished she had a mum to talk to, or that Aunt Gayle had been more of a mother figure. Susanna had never felt able to confide in Aunt Gayle, and instead sought advice from the teenage magazines she read, or from friends at school, or she simply got on with things. The lack of closeness with her aunt was partly her fault. She knew that, but Aunt Gayle had betrayed her shortly before she left the island for good, and she'd never been able to forgive her for what she'd done. Susanna had wanted to close that chapter of her life and never look back once Addie was also off the island. She walked towards the study and was about to knock on the door, but her hand dropped as she changed her mind. The sound of a child wailing carried through the open window of the lounge, grabbing her attention instead as she went to sit down in the squishy armchair. She could just about see a young woman near their drive doing battle with a toddler. Her competence reminded her of Addie and how she'd taken to motherhood so effortlessly. Susanna had never had the urge to procreate, and it wasn't only because, as the eldest, she'd been thrust into a childcare role in her teenage years, watching Addie after school instead of hanging out with her friends because Gayle was busy with her pudding business. She'd just never seen herself as a mum. She wondered whether it had anything to do with losing her own so young, but she doubted it. She just wasn't wired that way. But she was definitely wired to be a doting aunt. She adored her little nephew. Whenever Isaac visited, he loved to help her water the shrubs and plants with the hose, while Addie had a break, relaxing in an outdoor chair. And he'd keep her amused with his quirks, laughter, and funny chatter. She wondered, if they'd had kids, would Alex have cheated? If he was cheating at all, that was. A fact she'd never know unless she asked him. What was wrong with her? She wasn't this meek person who shied away from conflict. She wouldn't put it off any longer. They'd talk tonight, and she'd be able to make a plan to move forwards. Alex took her by surprise when he emerged from the study, and it was even more of a shock when he came over and pulled her to standing for an impromptu hug. It felt so good, so safe, like nothing could ever come between them. After things had ended messily with her first serious boyfriend, Matteo, who might well be living on Anchor Island with his family unless he'd sailed off somewhere exotic, Susanna had been put off getting serious with a man again. She'd been hurt, she was upset, and she'd vowed to maintain her independence. She liked making her own decisions, not needing a man to define her. She'd read an article in a magazine once, and that exact phrase had stayed in the forefront of her mind ever since. It was partly why she'd kept her surname, Rafferty, when she married, as well as wanting to keep hold of the link to the family she hadn't had for very long at all. She'd always been one of those Rafferty girls on the island, and she'd loved being thought of that way, despite her desperate need to escape. She remembered once, when she and Addie were in the Sweet Life Café, overhearing someone talking about those Rafferty girls freewheeling on their bicycles down the hillier parts of the island, their legs outstretched and their hair flying out behind them in the wind. That person hadn't approved, but Addie and Susanna had found it hysterical to listen to and vowed to keep doing it, which they did, getting faster and faster, laughing louder and louder every single time. When she took up a place at the University of East Anglia, Susanna finally got to leave Anchor Island, and it was like a whole new world opened up to her. A world that was her own. She had a small amount of money that her dad had left her, which, on top of the loans, saw her through. She finished her degree before moving to Cambridge to finish her studies and soon embarked upon her first job as a trainee solicitor. She had boyfriends, but never anyone serious, until she met Alex. They'd met when she was on holiday on the Norfolk coast with friends. Despite the swimming lessons she'd assumed were enough to keep her strong in the water and years of living on an island, she'd got into difficulty in the sea on the first day, a cramp in her leg making it near to impossible to stay afloat, let alone swim. She'd flailed around, desperately trying to move back to shore. Her head kept going under the water, but the next thing she knew, a strong arm had lifted her above the surface, and another muscular arm had aided the first, and she was on a surfboard before she knew it. The rescuer had paddled her back to shore with her beneath his torso, and when she finally stood up, she looked into the eyes of Alex Byrne, who worked at the beach as a lifeguard over the summer. If it hadn't been for her cramp that day, they might never have met at all. Alex Byrne, the man she'd finally let herself fall for. And now, despite being so much older, the idea that Alex might be hiding something still hurt as much as when things ended with Matteo when she was only 19.